All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's have order in the court, please. All right, it's good to see you. We're on air. We didn't have any music tonight. Tyler didn't have anybody lined up. I think he's kind of got a cycle about 3 weeks, so about 1 week out of 4, we don't have any music. So I said, well, that's good. I got a lot of material to cover tonight. So glad y'all are here. Glad to have those 2 young ladies right there coming in. I know, they're cooking for the kids. I know that. If y'all knew what they were making, you probably wouldn't want to be with me. You'd probably be over there. So I'm not going to tell you. So it's good to see you. Welcome to those that are online with us. I want to say thanks to Brother John. I don't know if he's watching this evening or not, but appreciate him stepping in last week. And I know he wasn't feeling well. And so I talked to him the other day to check on him and see how he's getting along. He's doing much better. So I appreciate him teaching last week. And just got to say, today is mine and my wife's 43rd wedding anniversary. And so I'm just grateful she's let me hang out with her all these years, you know. All you men know what I mean, don't you? Yeah? Yeah, I married up, as most of us usually do. So thankful for my wife. So, all right, so if you would, take your Bibles. Let's get into Judges chapter 16. There's quite a bit of material we'll cover. And kind of the climax, I guess you can say, conclusion to the story of Samson. And we were talking in the office about Samson today. And I guess probably most people, when they think about the book of Judges and they think about the different judges that are in the book of Judges, Samson probably is the one that comes to most people's mind. It seems to be certainly the most dramatic and entertaining story, if you want to use that term. And so we're going to wrap it up this evening. Now, if you remember, last time we were together 2 weeks ago in chapter 15, we saw where Samson used the jawbone of a donkey, and he slew a lot of Philistines and so forth, or as I said last week, he jacked a bunch of Philistine jaw with the jawbone of a donkey. And so today we're going to be talking about the passage that deals with, the chapter that deals with ultimately Samson and Delilah and the end of his life and ministry and so forth. So there's several things we'll be talking about, several headings in your outline. And the first one we'll talk about is Samson and a harlot. It says in verses 1 through 3, now Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there. Now let's talk about, just real quick, let me point out something on the map, okay? So, wait a minute, pulled my headset off. Are we still on? Okay, so if you remember, in the past, most of the activity that we have seen with Samson is in this area of Dan, right here, okay? Now he's all the way down here to Gaza, okay? So he's kind of strayed quite away from where most of everything we've known about him so far. So this is where he's at, is right down here. Now, I also point that out just to kind of highlight the fact that given what's in the news these days, what's known as the Gaza Strip. Now, this Gaza, that wasn't just simply a city. It was part of several Philistine cities that were established along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. It was certainly nowhere near, Gaza in that day was nowhere near the size of the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip goes basically all the way out here and all the way down to the Egyptian border. So it covers quite a bit more territory than just the city of Gaza. But I thought I'd just mention that since we're dealing with that. But so he's all the way down here. So he's a long way from home. And certainly now he's down really into the heart of the land of the Philistines and so forth. So we come back to verse 1, and we find that he's in Gaza. He goes there, sees a harlot, and goes into her. Obviously, a prostitute is who he's visiting. Again, we've seen this time and time again with Samson. So, and yet it's another reminder of Samson's carnal ways. Okay, This instance it's kind of just a blatant, open, there's no attempt, obviously, to hide it, that he's going into a prostitute. And yet, we still find God uses Samson, because as we've mentioned several times throughout this study, that the story is not really about Samson. He is a chosen tool that is not conducting himself the way God would have him to conduct himself, but the story is really about God's deliverance of Israel from the oppression of the Philistines. He's chosen to use Samson. He uses him despite his carnal ways, but the ultimate objective is the deliverance of Israel, God's people, and ultimately God's glory, that even through this, God gets glory because he is working to deliver his people. Pastor David Guzik made this interesting statement about Samson. I want you to listen to this. Quote, "Samson did what we nearly all do when deceived by sin. He put his life into categories and figured that some categories God cared about and some categories God did not care about. Understanding that Jesus has a claim over our entire life is a radical change of perspective." And so what he's talking about there is the tendency of a lot of believers to sort of categorize our life. This is sacred. This is what I let God have control of and oversight and wisdom and direction. But over here, I'm kind of keeping to myself so I can have it my way. And so he illustrates that practice through the behavior of Samson. And as I've said many times through this, that Samson is a tremendous illustration of what a carnal Christian looks like. A carnal Christian is somebody who's saved. They belong to God. They've been born again. Their name's written down in the Lamb's Book of Life, but they're categorizing their life and they're quarantining certain places from the influence of God and having their way in other places and so forth, and in the end doing a really terrible job of being a witness for Jesus. So verse number 2 says this. It says, when the Gazites were told that Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and they lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. That's kind of setting the stage for what's going to come in just a moment. So obviously, even down in Gaza, Samson's name and the things he has done previously has gotten around. So they're on the lookout for him, even down in Gaza. Although they're doing it cautiously because they're hiding. It goes on and says, they were quiet all night, saying in the morning when it is daylight, we will kill him. And Samson lay low until midnight, and then he arose at midnight. Apparently he must have become aware of what it is that they're plotting to do. And so it says he arose at midnight, and he goes out to the gate now where they're hiding. And it says, and he takes hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the two gate posts, pulls them up out of the ground, all of this together in a single unit, and he carries it out away from Gaza to a hill facing Hebron. So that's no small feat of strength that he's just demonstrated. Now, interestingly, it doesn't tell us that he killed any of the Philistines there that were laying in wait for him. Now, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But maybe he was just giving them a reminder of who it is that they're dealing with, all right? So that kind of brings us to that conclusion of that attempt to get to him. Then we come to, I guess, probably one of the best known, I don't want to call it, I guess you call it love affair, lust affair, Samson and Delilah, verses 4 through 20. Verse 4 says this, afterward it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. Now I would say this, Samson would not have been a good authority to talk to about what love is really like, you know. We've said before, the woman is that we've seen in the past. We talked about how I think he was probably motivated more by lust than love. He had that stuff kind of confused. He certainly had some kind of an emotional affection or attachment for her. F.B. Meyer says this right here. Listen to this. 3 women, one after another. So this is the third woman now that we've seen. The third Philistine, the third pagan woman, ungodly woman. And so remember, Samson is under what kind of vow? Of a life consecrated to God, all right? And yet here he is, he's pursuing these relationships with these ungodly women. But F.B. Meyer says this, 3 women, one after another, brought Samson down. Because if you watch, every time he gets into these relationships with these women, they tend to get worse and worse. It just keeps spiraling downward. 3 women, one after another, brought Samson down. If only a noble woman could have influenced him as Deborah did Barak, how different his record would have been. Let those who are eminent in spiritual capacity guard against the swing of their nature to the opposite, the sensual side. And so you think about what Samson might have become, the degree to which God could have used him in even greater ways had he chosen a woman who would have been a good and godly influence on him as opposed to an ungodly influence. He's an example of one of those who had a really bad habit of choosing bad women. Just like some women have a habit of choosing really bad men. You ever known people like that? It's like, don't you ever learn anything? And so Samson's just one of those guys. He had a habit of just always choosing the wrong woman, okay? So keep those words about that Meyer just spoke about Delilah and about the ungodliness and so forth. And listen to this right here. So here's an interesting thing, talking about these women, specifically Delilah. So, and we see this develop, and I'm certain you know the story and where it goes as we make our way through this, and how it ends for Samson in his relationship with Delilah. So I did a word study today, and I thought, I never thought about this before, but I said to myself, I wonder what the name Delilah means. So I got onto my lexicon that has concordance and all this sort of stuff, and it has the Hebrew and Greek words depending on whether it's Old or New Testament. So I'm in the Old Testament, so I'm looking for the Hebrew, and I look at Delilah, and the name Delilah means languishing. Okay? That's just another way of saying, basically, dying on the vine. Okay? Languishing away. It comes from a root word in the Hebrew that means, listen to this, to bring low, to dry up, be emptied. So I described it to the staff we were talking to about this, and I said, she was death walking on 2 feet. It was almost like, see, every time Samson gets in these bad relationships, these bad women, they get worse and worse and worse. And here he is now. He is in a relationship with a woman who is like death on 2 feet. No wonder it goes where it goes. Okay? Verse 5. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and find out where his great strength lies and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. And every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. Now, I've got 2 thoughts about that right there. First of all, I said a moment ago that Samson does have some kind of emotional attachment to this woman, all right? She certainly had no emotional attachment to Samson. How do we know? Because she took the deal without batting an eye. She didn't give one bit of resistance. There was no hesitancy whatsoever. She jumped on that deal. She was in love, but it was with the money. Now, you're talking about a pretty good sum of money. They talk about 1,100 pieces of silver. That would be 1,100 shekels. That's equal to 140 pounds of silver, 2,240 ounces. At today's rate, that's an equivalent of $51,040. That's a pretty good chunk of change today. You just imagine you're set for life back in those days. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we have some evidence here that Samson was not a Herculean specimen. I was talking with staff today. Kim and I were talking, and she made the comment. She said, I remember a movie about Samson. Some of y'all may remember the movie of Samson back years and years ago. I haven't seen it in a long, long time. But if you remember, and pretty much anything where Samson was typically portrayed, the guy that played the role of Samson was one of these sculpted looking bodybuilding kind of guys. The likelihood is that Samson was nothing like that at all. And the evidence to me is right here. Because had he been one of these Schwarzenegger, Herculean bodybuilder guys with muscles bulging from everywhere, they probably wouldn't have asked, find out where his strength comes from. I would dare say that Samson was just an ordinarily built guy. And obviously the strength that he had, he was not Herculean like Miguel. Oh, you're her Hercules, Miguel. Imagine that. So more than likely, if you would have seen Samson just standing in a crowd and you've never seen one of these great demonstrations of strength, you would never guess in any way whatsoever he could come close to something like that, because he was just an ordinarily built guy. So that begins Delilah's inquiry. And so I want to begin at verse number 6. So here we go. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you. And so remember, she really has no emotional investment in him. He has an emotional investment in her, and she's playing that card. Oh, honey, please tell me. Oh, baby, tell me, baby, please. But he never learns. No, he wasn't. I've said that. He was a sharp guy. He had an intellect, but when it came to using good judgment and common sense, he was striking out. So she says, please tell me where your strength lies. And Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, so the strings that would go on the bow, okay, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So the Lord brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, and she bound him with them. Now men were lying in wait, staying with her in the room. And she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he broke the bowstrings as a strand of yam breaks when it touches fire, so the secret of his strength was not known. So that's the first inquiry. Second inquiry, verse 10. Then Delilah said to Samson, look, you've mocked me and told me lies. Now please tell me what you may be bound with. And so he said to her, if they bind me securely with new ropes that have never been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Therefore Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And men were lying in wait, staying in the room, but he broke them off his arms like a thread. Third inquiry, verse 13. Then Delilah said to Samson, until now you've mocked me and told me lies. Tell me what you may be bound with. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of the loom. So she wove it tightly with the batten of the loom and said to him, could you see that picture with his hair tied into the loom? I mean, what a strange picture. He must be. Or he's just a jokester. He wants to joke around, And so she does that and says, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep, and he pulled out the batten and the web from the loom. He pulls it apart. Fourth inquiry, verse 15. Then she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? And you can see those doe eyes, can't you? You have mocked me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength lies. And it came to pass that when she pestered him daily and with her words impressed him so that his soul was vexed to death, he was tired of being badgered. That usually works. Yeah, I said a minute ago, Samson was an intelligent man. He had a good, but either he was just trying to play a game, or he's not using good sense, whatever he's doing. And they say love is blind. Now there again, I don't think, as I said a minute ago, Samson is a good source that you would want to go to for counseling about love relationships, okay? About how to have a healthy love relationship and so forth. But I do think he had an emotional attachment to Delilah of some kind, all right? But Samson was desperately in need of the wisdom that you learn in Proverbs that Solomon wanted to communicate to his son about women just like this. I'm going to take a minute. I want to read this because it's so in fact, obviously, what Solomon writes here was written many years after Samson. But when you read this, it's almost like he has Samson in mind. Now, if you want to look, I'm going to read from Proverbs chapter 7, verses 6 through 27. But it's where Solomon is counseling his son to beware of women like Delilah. Here's what he says. In the early part of the chapter, he talks about, son, I want to give you counsel and so forth. And he says, I want to give you counsel basically about women, okay? And he begins at verse number 6, and he says, for at the window of my house I looked through my lattice, and saw among the simple, I perceived among the youths, a young man devoid of understanding, lacking wisdom, passing along the street near her corner, and he took the path to her house in the twilight, in the evening, in the black and dark night. And there a woman met him, with the attire of a harlot and a crafty heart. She was loud and rebellious. Her feet would not stay at home. At times she was outside, at times in the open square, lurking at every corner. So she called him and kissed him with an impudent face. She said to him, I have peace offerings with me. Today I have paid my vows. So I came out to meet you diligently to seek your face. And I have found you, and I have spread my bed with tapestry, colored coverings of Egyptian linen. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloe, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love until the morning. Let us delight ourselves with love, for my husband is not at home. He has gone on a long journey. He has taken a bag of money with him and will come home on the appointed day. Verse 21. With her enticing speech she caused him to yield. With her flattering lips she seduced him. Immediately he went after her as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a fool to the correction of the stocks, till an arrow struck his liver, as a bird hastens to the snare. He did not know it would cost his life. Now therefore, listen to me, my children. Pay attention to the words of my mouth. Do not let your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths, for she has cast down many wounded, and all who were slain by her were strong men. Her house is the way to hell, descending to the chambers of death. You read that, it's almost like Solomon has this picture, but he doesn't have to have just Samson in mind. You know why? Been too many other young men who went down the path that Samson's gone down. Or it could be written in a different kind of way. Same thing could apply to women, and seeing the handsome guy, and all this sort of stuff, and all the flattery and the wooing and being drawn in and so forth. He says, be careful, leads to destruction. Verse 17, we get back to Samson and Delilah in their conversation. He told her all his heart and said to her, no razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. And when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up once more, for he has told me all his heart. So the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hand. And then she lulled him to sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. All right, so there goes the hair. But if you want to really get good insight into just how, remember what I told you what her name means? Languishing, dying on the vine, empty, to bring low, death walking on 2 feet. Look what she does. And she began to torment him. Don't know exactly how or what, but now remember, his strength is gone. He's just an ordinary guy. Not Dwayne the Rock, Hercules. He's just an ordinary guy. In fact, she might be stronger than he is. And there's someone else there, obviously, and so they torment him in some manner. And I imagine it had to do with some kind of probably inflicting physical pain or something upon him. Now, here's the question begging to be answered. Was Samson's strength lost because his long hair was shaved? Yes or no? Now, he said, if you shave my hair, it will be gone. But you know that other than that statement that he makes right there, there's no record in the rest of the story of Samson. Not even when you go back to when he was born, when his mother said he'll be a Nazarite and goes through all the different things about what he's supposed to observe and so forth. There was never anything else previously that attributed his strength to the length of his hair. Okay? I don't know if maybe Samson's just playing a game here because he's bad about that. He just like all this other stuff, he may have thought this is just another piece of the game. So here's my question. What do you think? Was his strength lost because his long hair was shaved? Yes or no? Okay. Do what? Look at what follows. Look at verse 20. And she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. So he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as before at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. So here's the thing, and Don touched on it. He has broken every other part of the Nazarite vow. I mean, he has just stomped on them. And we've seen this all the way through. And yet, despite all of that, God still uses him because he is seeking to help Israel. Samson is simply a flawed, very flawed tool, inflicting pain on himself and everybody else by his choices. But God still used him. But this was the one part of the vow. This was the last part of the vow he had never violated. And when he violated that part of the vow, at least there was one part of the vow that he had honored. He had never cut or shaved his head. But when that hair was shaved, that was the last piece of the vow that was not broken. And that was the time when God said, enough is enough. Enough is enough. You've gone too far. You've been shown grace despite, and now it's time for some chastisement, correction, and discipline. It's time for you to suffer the consequences of your choices. And that's exactly what happened. And so God's favor, God's power, God's presence upon his life was removed and pulled away. Now you think about that. That's not something that is uncommon to what we see or even experience ourselves. How often, how many times in our life have we sometimes pressed the margins and pushed the margins, and we've drifted and we've strayed and we've gotten on this shoulder of the road and that shoulder of the road, and sometime even in the ditch, we've gotten in the ditch, and God still is gracious to us and so forth. But there comes a point in time when God says, enough is enough. It's just like a parent. We're gracious with our kids, we're patient with them, we may reprimand them verbally, try to instruct them when they're kids and so forth, but there comes a point in time where enough is enough. You're going to pay a consequence for this. And man, what a consequence that he paid. So, let's look at that. In verses 21 through 25, we see where Samson is imprisoned and mocked. Verse 21 says, "Then the Philistines took him and put out his eyes, brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters." In past, he could have just popped them right off like a toothpick. Not this time. "And he became a grinder in the prison." Now, I mentioned that movie that was made back years ago. And we were talking in the office today, and I said the two parts of that movie that I remember is the part that after Samson is captured here, and I know his eyes were put out. I don't remember that particular piece, but the picture in my mind is I remember seeing him, his hand on the bar on that grinder, and he's like an animal. He's pushing that grinder around in circles. And it goes on for a long period of time that he was in there. And then, of course, the last part is where he's out there in the temple and he puts his hands on the pillars and so forth. But that picture of him, you know what? He was being used like an animal. That's what animals did. And they put him in there to do the work of an animal. There, of course, now we see that chastisement that we were talking about. Just like Hebrews chapter 12, the writer of Hebrews, who I believe to be Paul, he writes and says, look, there are going to be times God will chastise you. And he uses the analogy, just like parents have to correct their children. But God does it for our well so that ultimately we bear the peaceable fruit of righteousness. I love what Paul says. Parents do it for their pleasure. So they can have some peace. But God does it so that we'll experience the peaceable fruit of righteousness. And we see that working here. And so then it says in verse 22, "However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaven." Now, here's something, and this kind of sets the stage for what's going forward. Samson had to be corrected. It was time for him to face the consequences of his choices and his actions, and how he had just basically blown off this vow that God had put upon his life. But now his hair begins to grow. But now here's a really, even in that stall, that grinder, pushing that grinder, doing what an animal typically would do, this was the first time in Samson's adult life anyway, maybe as a child and young teenager, maybe he took his vow seriously, but we certainly know as an adult he didn't. This is the first time in his adult life that he has been able to faithfully honor every part of the Nazirite vow. No women, no unclean, nothing dead, no wine, and his hair begins to grow back. And God's using that to restore him for the final act and the restoring of his power in his life. So you see a transformation that's going on with Samson, and it's a result of him having to go through some pain. And God having to quarantine him, so to speak. And there are times when God works in our life in the same way, isn't it? Verse 23 says this, "Now the lords of the Philistines gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god, and to rejoice. And they said, Our God has delivered into our hands Samson, our enemy." Were they right or wrong? No, wait a minute, listen to the statement. Our God has delivered into our hands Samson, our enemy. Did their God deliver Samson into their hands? Nuh-uh. Samson's God did. Okay? And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, Our God has delivered into our hands the destroyer of our land and the one who multiplied our dead. Wrong again. Okay? Verse 25, "So it happened when their hearts were merry, they said, Call for Samson that he may perform for us. And so they called for Samson from the prison, and he performed for them." Now here's what that really means. They made sport of him, is what it means. In other words, he's blind. So you could just imagine that here they are. Oh, blind man, let's trip him. Watch him fall down flat on his face. Blind man, let's get up and let's kick him. Blind man, let's slap him. Blind man, let's hit him with a club. Blind man, let's throw some feces on him. You get the idea? They're humiliating him. But then it says this, and all this took place, it says, and they stationed him between the pillars. Now, you know, they were saying that their God had delivered Samson into their hands, and they don't realize God's the one orchestrating all this stuff, and they have positioned Samson in just the place where he needs to be for what's about to happen. And then we come to Samson's death, verses 26 through 31. "And then Samson said to the lad who held him by the hand, Let me feel the pillars which support the temple so that I can lean on them. And now the temple was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there, about 3,000 men and women on the roof watching while Samson performed." So get an idea of an arena, and there's seats in there, and it's full, and it's got like a balcony up top, and there's thousands of people up there, literally thousands of people gathered for this show. Verse 28, "Then Samson called to the Lord, saying, O Lord God, remember me, I pray, strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my two eyes." Now, you know, here's the problem. There's some parts of Samson that just never go away. I came to a conclusion today about Samson when I read that. I'm not so sure if to some degree Samson wasn't a narcissist. Even here it's about him. Even after all he's been through. That's a narcissist. Verse 29, "And Samson took hold of the two middle pillars which supported the temple, and he braced himself against them, one on his right and the other on his left. Then Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. And he pushed with all of his might, and the temple fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. And God answered Samson's prayer and restored Samson's supernatural strength, but not for Samson's personal vengeance, but for Israel's sake and for his glory." That's the reason why God answered that prayer. "And so the dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life." And I kind of sum it up like this. Samson's last day was his best day. He saved the best for the last, and he brought the house down. Verse 31 says, it concludes this way, and his brothers and all his father's household came down and took him, and they brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. He had judged Israel 20 years. And you know, while I know that there had to be mourning and grieving, Samson had caused his family a lot of pain and worry, consternation. It would have been easy for them to have just said, we're not going to fool with him. But they went and got him and brought him home, and they buried him and honored him. So for 20 years, he served as judge of Israel. All right, that concludes the Samson episode in the book of Judges. So any questions, thoughts? All right, we will conclude our Bible study with that. Thank you all for joining us online. Everybody have a great evening and stay warm. All right, Brother Don, turn it over to you, brother.